Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I'm pleased to be joined today by my good friend Dwight Gibson, who is not only a friend of mine, he's also has a very interesting profession in exploration. He's the chief explorer of the exploration group, something we'll talk about later. So, Dwight, thanks for agreeing to do this.
Aaron, it's great to be with you this afternoon.
You know, when we met back, I don't know when it was probably like in the 2010-11 timeframe, maybe something like that, when I was living in Chicago. It's been a long time. And I really just feel like I always hit it off with you. We have great conversations when we're just like hanging out because you have so many great perspectives on the world and helping to sort through. At that time I was going through like a really crazy period in my life, and you've gone through some of yours, and just trying to help put some perspective on it was very useful.
Yeah,
And
I think
so,
we took turns being crazy in
yeah,
these seasons of life, I think.
yeah, and so I thought this idea of exploration, which I think is a little, it's hard to explain. I think because we don't think that way anymore, which I think is one of your points. Is that we used to have this domain of exploration. When people were exploring, new continents, exploring, trying to get to the South Pole, the Lewis and Clark expedition, where people were really going off and trying to chart unknown areas. And yet, we see today we don't really do that. So can you just tell me, how do you define exploration, and how does that differ from what we do today?
Yeah, those are great questions and great preparation for this. I think I want to go back about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, prior to, let's say, 1890, 1900, that period of time. The people that were alive knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's a lot that they didn't know. Okay. And at that point, it was about the world. The North Pole, the South Pole, there were mountains that hadn't been climbed, etc. Come around 1890, the year to 1900, there was increasingly this sense that we kind of knew what was going on. Now, we really didn't, but we had a sense of it. So the Royal Geographic Society had made a list, and this is from a geographic standpoint, of kind of all the things yet to be found. And they were clicking them off. And as that list was getting lower, it's like we know what's going on. There were several other things that kind of came together. The Industrial Revolution, where we increasingly moved from things made by hand to things that we were replicating. And you put all that together, and I found it was kind of the move from the age of we don't know and we're exploring to the age that we do know, or that we think we know. And
Yeah,
I
it's
think,
interesting you say that because it was 1905, wasn't it, that Einstein published all of his famous papers? We were making all these amazing scientific discoveries
yeah,
right
yeah.
in there.
Yeah, and we were doing all this stuff, but increasingly, though, it was like somehow, if we can figure it out, we know. If we can
Hmm.
figure it out, we can kind of make this thing happen. And so you put all that together, and I think we moved from a world of kind of what if to what could be to this is the way it is. We were
Hmm.
in, and one of the key factors, Aaron, what you're saying is about control. We had a sense that we controlled. Prior to that point, we didn't think we knew, or we could admit. And I've come to the realization recently that humility is a critical part of exploration. I've always said curiosity is necessary to be a great explorer, but I've actually come to a deeper understanding that humility precedes curiosity. And there has to be the humility to say, I don't know, which in today's world is actually hard for a lot of people to admit.
Hmm. So, how did they approach these unknowns in that era?
Well, there were explorers. I mean, so you had the geographic explorers. People were studying. I think, in a sense, science was real science, and that there was a mystery to it all. And so how they approached it was observation. I've got one of the great books I've got over here on my shelf is called What to Observe. It was written by a guy by the name of J.R. Jackson, and they put editions of it out throughout the 1800s. And it was a guide for people to observe. And it was how to see things. And I think in many ways, we have stopped seeing things. And again, anything you say in this space, Aaron, you can almost can be an overstatement. But I think back in the day, people were curious, they were observing, they were learning how to observe. Today, we tend to look at things and say, "This is the way it is. This is the way it is."
You always see like excerpts from people's diaries from the 1800s, and they're talking about all these different plants and animals that they're seeing, all these different birds, and it's not so much that they've never seen them before. These are not even famous people. These are just like random people telling you in great observational detail, what's going on in the world in a way that if we were to have a diary today, it would be almost exclusively kind of our interior monologue of how we're feeling about things. Very little about what we're seeing.
Oh, that's totally. I mean, we could go off into a whole nother conversation about kind of the way the world is seen. But I actually was just recently came across some reading, and they picked up on exactly what you said. That at one point in time, if you said someone, are you successful? And the response is, yes, I provide for my family. I've got a good job. I've got a roof over my head, and it's about thinking about others, and it's observing the world around us and interacting with the world around us. When you ask a person, are you successful today? It tends to be, I feel good. I think I get good things at my work. It's all about me. It's not what I do in relation to the rest of the world. And I think that plays into what you're talking about with exploration here, is that exploration is recognizing that, in a sense, you're a part of the world, but you are not the world. And in many ways, that's a philosophical change that I think has happened. And in some ways, I think in the past, people were more open to exploration than they are today, because of this humility to admit that we don't know. Today, I have to have this. Success is perceived as I control. And to me,
I have a work plan of how I'm going to get there.
Yeah, not only do I control, I have a plan, and in a year from now, I'm going to get there. And I think that's actually been, again, honestly, that's one of the realities of today. I mean, you look back over the last year or so, chaos, unknown, rapid change, unparalleled times, you call it what you want. When we don't know what to do, we don't know what to do.
I do think that a lot of people have in recent years made reference to that. When prophecy fails, is that the name of the book? It's about essentially these doomsday cults and what happens when you've predicted the end of the world on a particular date and it doesn't happen. And apparently like half of the people keep staying with the group. They sort of double down on it.
Yeah.
But that sort of my one friend calls it the apocalypse that didn't come, has informed so much. It's like, and it's not just an apocalypse in the term of, in the sense of, disaster, but this idea that we have this vision of how the world is going to play out in the future. Hillary Clinton is going to be elected president in 2017, right? The idea that it's January 1, 2015, and not 2 years later, right, we're getting ready to inaugurate Donald Trump as president. It seems to violate every expectation that people have about the future. I think now that we do have this sense that we control the future, when things happen that are outside of our control, I think we don't handle it well. I think these more primitive societies, we want to call them that, understood that like stuff's going to happen, we just don't know about it. Like there's going to be a storm. We don't know the storm is coming, right? The tornado just hit you. The hurricane just arrived. We didn't have these like 10-day extended forecasts. We didn't have all this stuff. And all of a sudden it's like, if some little thing that we've predicted doesn't happen, it's like a major catastrophe. It's almost like something's wrong with the world.
Yeah. I mean, I find the verse from Scripture, there's many verses that I find from the Bible that are really intrigue me. The one that always I come back to is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And in that verse is the recognition is that there is something beyond me. And there, in a sense, it's a relationship beyond me. Most people want to live today like, me is the beginning of knowledge, or I am the beginning of knowledge. And it's like the fear of the Lord. There is God beyond me. It's the beginning of knowledge. And, as you're talking here, I find myself realizing that, for instance, over this last year of COVID, the people that I know, friends, and just people that I observed, the people that were most about having that plan, controlling their life, needing to be on top of every detail, those people went crazy this last year.
Mm-hmm.
They just went crazy because, using your doomsday kind of cult analogy, um, a year ago they doubled down, and then 3 months later they were doubling down again. And I know in one situation, the friend of mine just kind of like, I don't know what to do. I just don't know what to do. And I could see they kind of gave up because they no longer could control. And my response was, this is actually really good. I mean, it's just painful what's going on, but the recognition that we don't know is actually really free. It's not hindering, it's freeing.
Yeah. I just got an interesting comment here from David. He says, I wonder if our ability to observe has been degraded by technology, photography, video, instrumentation. We no longer need to practice observation.
There's that. Thank you, Dave. That's a great question, a great comment. And he's exactly right. You look back at, for instance, memorization. People needed to memorize facts or figures or know things. And today, literally, if I'm sitting right here, if my mobile phone breaks down, I've got a problem. It hit me a while back when I realized I didn't know my wife's phone number. I had no idea.
Don't ask me my wife's phone number. That's a problem.
Well, I made it a mind to memorize my wife's phone number. And I memorized my wife's, I memorized my mother's phone number. Now, if you ask me what, for instance, my kid's phone number is, no idea. And so I think Dave is right, is that there is the technology, whether it's, these tools, we capture something, but we capture it, but we're not thinking about it.
Yeah, it's I think about the phone as a great example because I know I have numbers memorized from before I had smartphones. But anybody I met after the smartphone came along, I don't know their telephone number. And his comment also reminds me of a column that Bob Greene, the Chicago Tribune columnist, wrote many, many years ago. And this is a paraphrase of a fair paraphrase, perhaps. But he's like, the camcorder has destroyed family history. Yeah. Whereas it used to be you'd have a family reunion and Uncle Bob would do something funny. And then every year after year, people would tell the story about when Bob did something funny. And it just kind of grew with the telling. And it became this legend. Well, now we have the tape of it. You pull out the tape, you realize, oh, it actually wasn't very funny after all. It's like, there's a lot of, there's a lot that's, you can't, we've lost. Through that. And I think there is. And, so much, that period of time that you highlighted, so much was happening. I didn't make the connection to the physics papers until then, but I definitely thought about 1890 was the conventional date for the closing of the frontier, in America, for example. It was really between 1870 and, say, 1905, 1910 that we had the first large companies, that were there. Prior to 1870, almost every company was fewer than 100 employees. It was a capitalist society, but it was mostly smaller proprietorships. During the late 19th century, we converted into large-scale corporations. The railroads were the very first corporations as we know them. And to run a corporation, you have to have a different bureaucratic style of management. James Burnham wrote a famous book in, I think, 1942 called The Bureaucratization of the World. That was Bruno Rizzi, who was a Marxist guy from there. Sorry, he wrote The Managerial Revolution. Bruno Rizzi wrote another great book, but it was more about the Soviet Union. So I think there was a lot going on there and I draw this distinction between pre-industrial and industrial, but there's something about society, say, circa 1830, when Tocqueville's writing about America, and society circa 1920, when we're living in large cities with large companies, electric lights, telephones, indoor plumbing, scientific discoveries advancing, steamships, airplanes now invented. World War I has even happened. We've had this mechanized war. And it's just it's so radically different. We can't wrap our heads around what it's like.
Yeah, let me comment on that. I think you're onto something there that was a fundamental change in society. When I look at kind of the growth of the industrial kind of the revolution and all that happened, it was through the 1800s and into the 1900s. When you had those small businesses, whether it was a carpenter or a blacksmith or you name it. I'd say everything was being created was one at a time. Like, the glass that I have with water in here would have been hand blown one at a time. And every one that was made was an opportunity for a discovery because it was made one at a time. With the Industrial Revolution, suddenly you were making 1,000 glasses an hour, exactly the same. They were being punched out of a machine. And this kind of the modern was the uniformity. And what I've observed is that when it was being made one at a time, we lived in a what if world. Every time something was made, it was a new opportunity for discovery. And with that growth that you're talking about, for instance, you're talking about the railroad. That was one of the big movements that led to the synchronization of time. So, you got Eastern Standard Time, Mountain Standard Time, et cetera, around the world. It was the railroads needed to run on time. And so they consequently had to have these clocks kind of synchronized by a standard way. It's the same with from manufacturing, nuts, bolts, screws, et cetera. They needed to have a certain uniformity. And I've read some really fascinating materials on regulations and kind of the synchronization of all these different things so that there were certain standards. And so what we did is we moved from this what if world to a this is the way it is world. And with the size of the corporation, the bureaucracy, et cetera, that you're talking about, it allowed us to move to a scale that, in a sense, and I think it's just a very natural movement as you were talking, as we move from kind of creating one at a time to this is the way it is, this is the way it runs. And by the natural, kind of natural coming out of that, I think it leads away from exploration, where you're creating, to management. And the premise that I would say, Aaron, is that in order to manage well, you actually have to have explored well first. And again, it's just as we're talking here, I think in another time, in another era, at an individual level or at an individual family level, exploration was just much more of a natural part of your day-to-day life than it may be today.
Yeah. So, we went through this phase, I think, in the after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, we hit this end of history moment, as they say. And I think the argument of the end of history in Fukuyama's article and book was that we have essentially reached, we do know ideologically, if we want to call it from not necessarily that every place will be this kind of liberal democracy, but this is the age of ideology has sort of come to an end, and we've now arrived at this state. And we had this world that seemed to have this set of rules and ways, and it worked, in a sense. But now I think we're getting into I don't know if it's ideological history per se, but it seems like history is happening again. There's a lot of things happening that seemed outside the world we thought we understood, say in the late 90s or that. And so being able to recapture, I think, some of these exploration concepts is very important. So in terms of today, I'm facing an unknown future here, post-COVID world. We don't know what's going to happen. How do I, or an institution or a company, go about exploring today? I guess, what do you do as an explorer?
Well, yeah, good question. I think first of all, it's to recognize that there is a way to explore. I think most people think, how do I manage my way forward? How do we go forward? And what I would say from an exploration standpoint, managing is about replicating. It's about control. It's about efficiency. It's about something that was done before and doing it again, replicating it, doing it again. And that's actually really good. And most of what we do is in that sphere. I think with the environment that we have today and the reality of the world today is that we actually have to explore. And there's actually a methodology. There's a way of exploration that we discovered. A number of years ago when I started stepping into this space, I'd always known I kind of did things a little differently. I'd gone to Cornell, did executive training there. I'd been involved in various, kind of training things early in my career. And while I did it okay, I was never great at management. But the organizations that I was in always said, Dwight, you make things happen. You do something here, and it's differently. Long and short of it, over time, I came to the realization, and actually it's funny, Aaron, as you know, I'm a book guy. So I got constantly, I'm reading books. When I was in first grade, my mother gave me this book, Story of Thomas Alva Edison. I grabbed it off my bookshelf today. This was like, well, what did it cost? I think it was 45 cents. Yeah, 45 cents. My mother bought this for me in first grade, and I wore it out. I wore the binding out, so she bought me a second one, and I've still got both of them. I'm not a hoarder. I just keep the things that are important. Let's put it that way. But anyway, Edison, what I saw was this guy that was experimenting, and without, I kind of just took this into my life. So the long and short of it, what I realized, and I don't know if you want to pop up the one of the slides that I sent there, but there's a core step of exploration, and it's pondering, landmarking, and orienteering. That core step is something that every explorer always does. And what I had found is that when it comes to doing exploration work, every explorer I ever studied, ever I looked at, always did this. And you see this right in the center of this. And it's pondering, landmarking, and orienteering. Pondering is the observing. It's what's going on, trying to understand what's happening. Landmarking are the insights that come out of your pondering, and orienteering are creating new value chains based on the insights that have gained. And so that's the heart. And whether it's Thomas Edison, whether it's Lewis and Clark, whether it's Magellan, you name an explorer, you name a pioneer. Peter Drucker, known greatly in the world of management, I contend that he was an explorer in the world of management. Entrepreneurs are explorers in the world of business. They're the people that look at it a new way. That's the heart, pondering, landmarking, and orienteering. Before that, you've got to expect. And then in kind of coming back to your question for today, what are you looking for? Post-pandemic, what's out there? Do you want to start a new business? Do you want to start a new career? Do you want to move to a new place? What is out there that you're looking to get to and go to that's beyond where you are now? And then the crossroads. The crossroads, every explorer made a crossroads decision. I'm going to change the status quo. I'm going to spend money. I'm going to spend time. I'm going to change my life. I'm going to move. Expecting and crossroads set us up to explore. And then the last steps, realization and evaluation, are once you've hit that destination. The realization is the flag in the North Pole. The evaluation is say, okay, now that we've learned this, where do we go from here? Thank you. Thanks for showing that, Aaron. That's the essence of exploration. And in looking at that, when you say, what can I do today? Ponder. What am I seeing? What's going on? Out of that, what are the new insights? What are the landmarks? And then start putting those together and see if they lead you in a new direction. That's the opportunity for today. And here's what I learned, Aaron. Each one of us have an opportunity to be an explorer. Each one of us can create. Each one of us can innovate. You know, I used to think exploration is only in the realm of great people. Oh, I could never do what Thomas Edison did. Oh, I could never do what Lewis and Clark did. Oh, I could never be an Einstein. The reality is they all followed this same path. They pondered, identified new landmarks, and then they went forward based on it. Aaron, you can do that. I can do that. Anybody who's listening today, it's teachable, it's replicatable, it's scalable. And that was the great insight that I had, because it's not just the great people that can do that. I would make the case, these are simple, ordinary people. And Edison, he went to school less than a year of his life, but the guy had the ability to do, great things. And you look at even some of the, kind of the great entrepreneurs today, every one of them dropped out of college, kind of thing, or didn't go in the first place, but they followed this same path.
It's interesting. I when I hear about exploration and the unknowns, I was pondering that, and I divided it into two basic categories of things that I see people talk about. One is, I know where I want to go, but there's no path to get there, right? How do I do it?
Yeah.
But I have an idea of what the end goal is, if you want to call it that. This could be like starting a company or the career. I think the second one is, I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm going. I'm not sure where I want to go. I'm just stuck in this space. And maybe we can talk about both of those, but the first one is somewhat amenable to the startup. It's somewhat like the startup model.
Yeah.
And I know I hearing you talk about exploration, for a very long time before the book came out, but I thought immediately of Peter Thiel's From Zero to One. And he makes this big distinction between, once you've got one, you mass produce the copies. You move into this realm of management.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to get from 0 to 1, when you have nothing and you're trying to create the first of something, that's a very different methodology. So he sort of swagger jacked you there maybe a little bit, but how do you think that this like compares to the concept of 0 to 1 in the startup world?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarity, and I remember, this is for me personally as an explorer. I had started seeing this process, this methodology, as I was reading various books, 15 years ago. And as I was reading these books, I said, this person is doing this person's doing, and they were all following the same thing. And I ended up discovering that there was a course on exploration taught at the Royal Geographic Society in London. It had been taught for years, and then it was stopped like 70, 80 years ago. And I had an opportunity to go to London, and I specifically arranged an appointment at the archives, the Royal Geographic Society, right across from Hyde Park in London. And I said, I want information about this class. And Aaron, what I was looking for was the class book. I figured I'm going to go there and I'm going to find the course book. It's just going to got this little plan and I'm going to copy it down. And I still remember the day. It was a summer day. It was a beautiful afternoon. I get there, sky was blue. I walk in, all this anticipation, all the materials are laid out for me. I'm studying it. I'm looking at it. But I didn't find the course book. I didn't find the secret sauce. But I saw they taught people how to use or figure longitude, latitude, barometric pressure, how to survive outdoors. Kind of this book, What to Observe, told you how to observe, all this stuff. But no methodology that I had seen was not there. So I get done with the afternoon. The archivist says to me, Mr. Gibson, did you, were you successful in your research this afternoon? I said, well, partially. I didn't find everything I wanted. And I said, here's what I'm looking for. There's this methodology of exploration. I've seen it. I named some of the different explorers. I said, they all follow this methodology. And I thought there would be a course book here that would teach that because it's so obvious that they do it. And I say this to the archivist, Aaron, and she looks at me, goes, I don't think anyone's ever studied that before. And I remember then I'm sure if there had been a mirror, I had this kind of crazy look on my face and I said, oh. And I still remember to this day walking across Hyde Park and I said, this is my exploration. I need to codify these steps that I have seen, find the vocabulary, find the words, and that's what I just presented. And so when you say, what's the comparison? A lot of similarity. I would make, a couple of years ago, I was interviewing a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who sold his company to Google. And I was talking through these things to learn about what he had did. And when we were done talking, he says, hey, can I ask you a few questions now? Tell me about the methodology. Tell me about this process. Help me understand it. And I explained it to him. And he said, that's exactly what I did. He said, I've had all kinds of people say, what did you do? And I couldn't tell them. And here's my hunch, Aaron. Most explorers, they do this intuitively. They do it naturally. It's not been codified. They're not documenting because they're excited about doing the exploration. It is such a natural step that it's kind of like right in front of our faces, but we don't see it. And so whether it's Peter Thiel or Dwight Gibson or whoever it is, when it comes to exploration, I think we've got a secret sauce here, again, that's applicable to all of us. And there may be some different words to it, but I think this is the essence of what it means for us to really explore and move forward today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I do see so many cases where the existing approaches are not working.
Yeah.
And we need to think about, how do we explore our way out of this place, this jam, that we found ourselves in. So I'll mention that the startup, the Silicon Valley startup, Elon Musk going to Mars, colonize Mars. How he's going to get there, he doesn't know. But he's like, well, I got to get a rocket. First thing I got to do is get there. So he said, he always says this view, solve the hardest technical problem first. He's like, transportation is the hardest problem. I'm going to solve that. But at least he knows Mars is there. He knows what it looks like. We know a heck of a lot about Mars. We get into the second part is we don't know where we're going. And, you and I are both from the Midwest. So you're from Michigan. I'm from Indiana. And the Midwest has been falling behind the country for 50, 60 years now. Since we went through this kind of deindustrialization phase, nobody has really cracked the code on how you turn this region around. And, it seems like, the Midwest needs to learn how to explore to find its way out of here.
Yeah.
So I'm curious your take on it because you've talked about it. I think your line was pragmatism killed Michigan. And to me, pragmatism is the antithesis of exploration. So I'd be interested in you sharing some of the insights about that. Maybe let's apply exploration to the problems of the Midwest, and what's going on today, and what might a different approach look like.
This is, as you know, Aaron, this is an area that's close to my heart, and frankly, it's one that deeply concerns me. Here's kind of my take at a simple level, and I'm sure people could push back on this and have. But here's the reality that I found is that pragmatism grows very much out of an engineering mindset. I think, again, part of the strength of the industrial age was the mass production, was the scale up of organizations, cost went down, etc. And there was just all kinds of positives about it. The downside is it created a certain rigidity into the system, into the process. Years ago, I met a professor from University of Michigan. His name just escapes me right now, but he was a professor who did a lot of work looking at industrial companies. And I met him at a conference in California. And afterwards, I said, "I'm from Michigan." I said, "Is there hope from Michigan? Is there hope?" And he goes, "There's great hope." I said, "Oh, really? Help me understand that." And his response was, "Go up north." And anybody from Michigan knows, you go up north. People have cottages up north, and that up north is anywhere north of where you live in Michigan. So, it doesn't have to be the Upper Peninsula, but just northern where you live. And there's lakes and things, and that's where people go in the summer. And they have cottages. And he says, "Dwight, go up north." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Look at what people are doing at their cottages. At their cottages, they're creating things. They're doing things in their hands." And then he said this line. He says, "The wisdom of the state of Michigan is in the hands of the people. The only problem is the workplace, which is now highly regulated and regimented, doesn't allow the hands to be creative any longer in the workplace. People exchanged, 5, 10, 50, whatever number dollars per hour to do someone else's routine, but they are no longer allowed to be creative with their hands in the workplace." He says the reality, it's still there. So I went to Northern Michigan. I started looking around, and I realized he was right. All kinds of creativity outside of the workplace, but in the workplace, the industrial kind of the rigidity of the assembly line has affected the way work gets done, the way that life gets done, and people end up putting things in nice boxes that are nice and kind of smooth. Now you end up having hostile workplaces, you end up having all kinds of things that are happening. But I would make the case that the real creativity, the freedom to kind of create things with the combination of the engineering thinking that is true, whether it's Cleveland, whether it's parts of Chicago, Detroit, so many other cities in this region that excelled in the industrial era, in the post-industrial era, a mindset has come in and a way of work that has come in that doesn't allow the freedom that's necessary. When it comes to exploration, I see kind of three categories of people. There's settlers, there's brokers, and explorers. All three are necessary for good organizations, good societies. I would make the case that settlers tend to push explorers out. Explorers tend to get frustrated with settlers. Brokers are just doing deals. You always find brokers wherever you go, but they even start doing hollow deals that don't really have value. They just do deals for deal's sake. And so when it comes to what we're talking about here, yeah, I think Midwest, and I think a lot of parts of our country need to rediscover exploration, and people need to recognize that they have agency. So much of what we see today is a denial that I have agency to do something. And so I have great hope for Michigan. I mean, I'm involved with a major engagement right now in the Chicago area. I love the Midwest. Even though I live here in New Jersey, I'm a Midwest person at heart, and I have great hope. But I would actually have to say I'm probably one of the explorers who just didn't find a place and ended up going elsewhere. And I think it's fascinating when you go to the Silicon Valleys of the world, and here in the United States, how many people you'll find from the Midwest that were kind of moved out into that direction
Yep.
because there was a place.
Silicon Valley was built by people from the Midwest,
Yeah.
largely.
Yeah, in the same way, it's interesting. You look at the, Michigan, the initial investments, for instance, in the 1800s were all from Boston and New York City. There were people from the East that invested in there. The automobile companies, the DuPont family and others, the money that went in there. And now those people ended up doing stuff out in Silicon Valley. And then their kids, are now the employees of those companies or even founders.
Yeah, I want to. I mean, I could talk about the Midwest all day, but I know a lot of people here are very interested in talking about the Christian world.
Yeah.
And I really think the Christian world is in, much like the political world, is in a deeply uncertain time. I mentioned, the thing that resonated the most of anything I've written in my newsletters is this idea of the positive, neutral, and negative world, that we went from kind of this pre-1994 era when the culture was positive towards Christianity. It was Christian morals had a sort of normative force in society, even for those who weren't Christian. To be known as an upstanding church-going man, is a status enhancer. People want to hire you. And I just think about like the organization Moral Majority. That probably wasn't right even then, but at least you could plausibly pretend to represent a majority. Then I think you get into this era from 94 to 2014, where I called the neutral world. Christianity is no longer the norm. It's not necessarily a positive, but it's not a negative either. And it's what I call the cultural engagement era. I always use the example, you're a Christian, I'm a vegan. Let's sit down and have a conversation. We've each got our own little thing. You do you, they might say. And then after 2014, we've gotten into what I call the negative world, which is this idea that the world actually looks negatively on Christianity. To be known as a highly religious person is going to count against you in the higher status domains of society. Christian morality is explicitly repudiated and even viewed as, in some respects, undermining the new social order. And I've made this point over and over that, we had this sort of, call it the religious right strategy, or, a lot of the big parachurch organizations came out of that kind of, the positive world era. We had like another wave in the negative world era with a lot of the urban church movement and new Calvinism and new monastics and all that stuff. There's a bunch of new movements came along. But in this negative world, there hasn't been much. Again, I say Rod Dreher and his Benedict option idea, which got a lot of airplay, but not a lot of people really resonating with it. To be honest, he had a lot of pushback on that. Was the only person talking about this, and now I feel like these organizations are realizing that they have to navigate through a future that's going to look different than it's ever been before. And I keep, in terms of navigating this negative world, what I go back to is when the Hebrews were about to enter the promised land. So you had this generation that had been in Egypt is all dead. So you've got a group of people who have never known anything except life in the desert, if you will. Now they're about to cross the Jordan River. And there's some line, I think it's in Joshua, where it says, keep 200 feet back, follow the ark, because you have not been this way before. You're going off into a place you've never been. You've never been here, so you got to follow this arc as it goes along, and you better it because you don't know where you're going. And I feel like that's where we are now. We've had this comfortable environment, such as it is, and now we've moved into this place. Wow, we've never been in this place before. And just because other types of Christians in other countries, other eras have had similar experiences, the generational experiences of the people here in the United States has been very different, and so we have to, this is where I think exploration is so critical to figuring out what to do next. And a lot of people are not really doing it. But what I want to ask you about, that's kind of the preamble to asking you about this engagement you're working on right now. So I'm gonna ask you about some of your clients. Maybe I know about, and I don't know if you have as you know, I know you don't like the word consultant, but I'm a consultant, so that's how I think about the word. As when you're a consultant, you can't just talk about your clients without permission. So feel free to shut me down to anything, because sometimes I know things that maybe we shouldn't discuss live. But you're doing, you're doing some work for Trinity International University in North Chicago. I think most people watching this probably know that through Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is very well known, very well respected. they're trying to navigate this. They've had COVID hit. We got a lot bearing down on universities. What's going on there, and how did you get engaged with them, and what's going on in that?
Yeah, Trinity International University is a great university, and I'm excited to be a part of the team there with the president Nick Perrin and a number of others. Yeah, it's part of the exploration, Aaron, is what's the word I'm looking for? It's being open. It's being open. And in 2019, I was in a small engagement with one of the centers at the school, helping them sort some things out. And one thing led to another. And I meet the president of the school February of 2020, pre-COVID, in the pre-COVID world. And then we're talking, and he says, I love what you're talking about, because I was making a presentation of some things that I thought he needed to do as president on behalf of this center that I was doing some work with. And I still remember him saying, this is really interesting. I want to talk to you, Mark. When can we talk? Can we talk soon? Can we talk soon? And I said, yeah. I looked at my calendar. I said, tell you what, next week you got your spring break. Why don't I come back next week? And he goes, yeah, done. Let's do it. So I flew back to Chicago a week later and met with now good friend Nick Perrin, the president of the university. And we talked some more, and we spend the whole day talking about exploration. And he's talking about the school and what they're thinking and where they're going and the possibilities for the future. But he's also talking about, I got some things we got to sort out. Higher education, Christian higher education. We got a lot to figure out right now. The business model's changed. There's kind of this cliff of demographics, the less number of kids, just a number of things at play. And he says, I got to figure out the way forward. And we end the day by saying, this is interesting. Let's talk some more and let me think. And I said, yeah, let me think about this. I think there may be something here. To cut to the chase, over the 3 days later, COVID hits and the country closes down. That plane was, until just recently, was the last full plane that I'd flown on for, numbers of months, or for many of us didn't fly anywhere at all. But anyway, we start talking, and one thing leads to another. And not only does he invite me to do an exploration at Trinity, because of some personnel changes, he actually invites me to join the staff. And I got to tell you, Garrett, I'm going to say Garrett. One of my colleagues is Garrett, and so for some reason I'm wanting to say his name right now. But Aaron, when he invited me to join the staff of the school, you could have knocked me over with a feather. It was out of nowhere, nothing I expected, but I knew exactly that was something I needed to do. And so I stepped into it. I'm the interim vice president for advancement at Trinity. And over this last year, I have led an amazing team. I've been working from an exploration standpoint, helping Trinity navigate what it means to go forward in these days, COVID days, but also where we are in the world today and looking forward. And this exploration has been exhilarating and been amazing, because higher education is at a point of change. Trinity is at a point of change. Christian organizations all over the world are at a point of change. What does it mean to do that? What does it mean to live into that? And as we're walking together, I'm recognizing that this is not overnight. People say, oh, this is great. Let's get this thing fixed in a week. Let's get this change happening in a day. And just this morning, I was thinking about Eugene Peterson and the phrase, a long obedience, in the same direction. That's a great phrase. We all love that phrase. We all want to do that until you're Lewis and Clark and it's a rainy night in North Dakota and you've already been out on the trail for 60 days and you hurt and your horse is sick and you're sick and you miss home. And so all that to say, I've entered a longer term exploration with Trinity, and I think it's going to go to some great things, and we're seeing good things happen. But you know what? It's taking work, and I think in these days we have to be willing to lean into the hard work. And for organizations that we're stuck in a certain way. Yesterday, you may know, Aaron, I like old postcards, and I bought an old postcard online yesterday, and it was from about 120 years ago. And it's a postcard of an old trolley. And on the trolley, it says Salvation Army First Outing. And it's a bunch of people on this trolley car heading to an outing somewhere. And I bought the card basically as a reminder to say, The way we used to do things is not necessarily the way we're going to do them going forward. In 1909, whatever they were doing, that was the right strategy, and that was a good strategy. That's not the strategy today. I was reading a piece, and I'm connected with a camp in Michigan, Simpson Park Camp near north of Detroit in Romeo, Michigan. Like the oldest church in town is closing down, putting their building up for sale, and reorganizing. And it's like this historic building on the main street of town. The way we used to do things, it may need to look different today. And so, long answer to your short question about Trinity. I'm excited to be a part of this great university. We're trying to navigate the way forward. The president has asked me to be a part of that. Got a great team of vice presidents, staff, faculty, and I think we're going to see great things as we go forward. But you got to explore. You got to be open to change. You got to know. And actually, here's the other thing: is like you got to know what you need to hold on to. Change is not just about getting rid of everything. It's knowing why are we here. What are the truths? In our case, biblical orthodoxy is very critical. This is a school that's about biblical orthodoxy. People raise questions here and there, but at the core, we are about biblical orthodoxy. The president has said, when it comes to our priorities, we want to be mentoring in hope, worshiping in faithfulness, and building bridges in love. And we are committed to the scripture. That the basis for that, all of that grows out of scripture. And I think so today, what's the question? What does it mean to live as Daniels in a world of exile today? We talk about, didn't inhale. Daniel never inhaled. He was true to Yahweh in the land that was great difficulty. I think another great question today, what does it mean to pass on our faith to the next generation? Parents are asking that. Grandparents are asking that. What does it mean for living faith to live in this world today? And so, man, I'm excited to be about Trinity because we're asking hard questions and we're leaning into it and moving forward wisely. So it's a wonderful exploration, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these organizations do need to reinvent themselves, and there are a lot of fundamental questions around, again, a financial model. It's like, biblical orthodoxy versus taxpayer support. There's the demographic cliff. The people are, the student loan debt crisis. There's, the shrinking numbers of Christians, and people questioning maybe the value proposition of that. There's so much to navigate through, and I think it is one where, like, if you could create a very simple strategy, here's what we're going to do, you wouldn't be an exploration. You're just like, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring this in. It's going to be like a private equity restructuring. We're going to buy this thing out. We're going to sell this off, these assets. We're going to monetize this, do a layoff, do this and that, and then we're gold. But I think there are these things that are just, we just don't know where we're going. And it's just like with the startups, right? There's always these pivots. There's like the mythological pivot where I relate that somehow to the orienteering and the landmarking and like, okay, now we've learned some things, and this direction we're going ain't going to work. We got to go over here.
Yeah. Well, and to take that another step further, we've been conditioned that we want that to happen in a day or a week or a month. Look through the stories of scripture. Children of Israel, 40 years in the wilderness while things changed. Moses, 40 years of preparation. Joseph, 20 years of preparation. Jesus, 30 years of preparation. And you look at this was not like read this book and you're ready to go, or do this online class and you're ready to go. You'll have all the answers. Again, one of the things, and I've heard this from alumni at Trinity. They said, you can go to a lot of schools that'll give you the answers. There's not too many schools that'll help you understand what the questions are you should be asking. And I think today we've got this kind of prescriptive, give me a simple pill and make it all good. And you know what? My wife and I have been married for 37 years. And some days it takes a lot of work. I love my wife. She's an amazing wife. But you know what? It's 37 years of learning how to love my wife, 37 years of her learning how to love me. And we're walking together, and it sometimes just takes time. And it's always good. It's kind of like Aslam, is he good? Yes, but it's not always easy. It's a little dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's this, I think this mentality that we have where we want to feel like we've got the plan to get there. We got to know the road. So discourages people from taking the steps that they need to do. I mean, again, in the Midwest, there's all this talk about, there's not a lot of high risk capital here. You don't go to the venture capitalist and walk away with a check for $1 million because they think you're pitch deck is pretty good. These are probably the people who still want the traditional business plan with all the pro forma financial statements and all this stuff. And so you end up not doing it. And I see that when people are really willing to take, not a foolish step, because these explorers prepared for what they were doing,
Yes.
but take a step into an unknown situation, the results can be, pretty amazing. I think a lot of church planting falls into that. That's the one thing that seems to be, and I guess there are a lot of methodologies for church planting. Now, there are a lot of formulas. Okay, so, I don't want to say it's not formula driven, but I think about Tim Keller starting Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York. It's like, hey, you want to go start a church in New York? Well, a bunch of people turned it down. It's like, how's this going to work? They tried once before. The denomination tried once before. It didn't work. They learned some things. They did it differently the next time. For example, they allocated a lot more money the second time around. But then he came there and he's got to get the lay of the land. And he's got to figure out how to navigate and look for opportunities. And you do it if you hadn't taken the first step. If you had to have the plan for what you're going to do, I got to have this, you'd never start it. I think about the church I attended in New York was a church that had had a building that was a landmark building, but it was falling apart. Needed needed $20 million in repair. So there's a building that needs $20 million in repair. It's covered in scaffolding. Has no endowments. It's down to like 15 to 30 people in this church. Theologically, it's there's no theology there. The pastor of that church doesn't believe Jesus is the Son of God and or anything like that. He's a Unitarian at best. He was described to me as. And so people came in there and just said, you know what? We think that this church is not dead yet, that we shouldn't give up on this. And so they just came in, and over the course of 10 years, well, probably more than 10 years now, this was probably in like 2007, they sort of repopulate the church, figure out how to bring in a new pastor. They have to, there's like one kind of disaster after the next. They have to get out of the denomination because they got a lot of problems with the denomination, and that took years of wrangles. And then they had to just slowly build all this stuff up. Then they had to do like a massive fundraising campaign, all this stuff. But then all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, now there is you fast forward 13 years later, now there is a vibrant, gospel-believing church at 64th and Park Avenue in Manhattan in this incredible, John D. Rockefeller paid for building. Now it's renovated. It's like, if people hadn't said, I'm not going to do that, I'm just not going to do that, none of that would have happened. You have to have some people who are crazy.
Well,
you got to have some people. You got to have some people who are kind of crazy to even do this stuff.
Well, you're exactly right, and this is where you're asking the pragmatism question. Very few pragmatists are crazy, but you need a few crazy people. That my oldest son, a number of years ago, we were talking about something, and I said, about being a father and how I've done as a father, and he says, Dad, let me be honest with you. Mom and I are very practical. Yeah, if it wasn't for you, we would have had a lot less fun in our family. Because they're very practical. Let's kind of be very careful and stuff. Dad,
you're kind of hitting something that's causing a little noise there.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and he said you're doing Dad, you brought the craziness into the family that made things fun, and interesting. And I think that's where, when you talk about, in order to be an explorer at times, you do have to be a little crazy because you're stepping into the impossible. And otherwise, you're just going to kind of tweak your way along or incrementally get away along. And the explorers of the world are the ones that say, you know what, we're gonna take the time and we're going to do this church in New York City. It's a Tim Keller says, you know what, we're going to start a new church in New York City. It's an Elon Musk saying, you know what, we're going to figure out how to get to Mars. It's the crazy ideas. For instance, this last year at Trinity, we set so the area that I've been involved in is advancement. And hear me on this. We're not, we need funds and we need our donors and we need our students. But we set some ambitious goals last year, and I thank God there was great provision for the school. But early on, I said, I think this is what we need to set as a goal. And somebody said, I said, what do you think? And they said, you're crazy. That's what I think. I said, okay, but I think that's what we need to do. And not only did we hit that goal, we exceeded it drastically. But if we had just done the incremental pragmatic thing, we would have never got there.
Yeah, I think there's so much of this. I think about, there's, I look at like what what Jim and Doug Wilson did out in Moscow, Idaho. Again, they're not everybody's cup of tea, but Jim Wilson's like, well, I guess I better pack up my van with books. I'm going to go out to this place I picked off a map and start something. And you just don't. I mean, again, in the Midwest, you just don't see these crazy ideas.
Yeah.
You don't see. I mean, crazy is the wrong word, but you don't see people willing to take a step, into the unknown, into a high risk situation. Some of the explorers died, right?
Yeah.
And say, because it's like if it's like this, like there's like a lack of faith or something there. I don't want to make it too theological, but it's like there's such a play it safe. It's like I can't get out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
I can't get out of what I've always known, because if I and that's why these places like Silicon Valley, where insane ideas are like, oh yeah, I'll give you some money to try that. What's the worst that happens, right?
Yeah, but I would push back though. Here's where I would push back. It's not that the Midwest doesn't have the potential, and it's not that somehow Silicon Valley has all the potential. Because if you look back in the early 1800s, for instance, the Midwest was the place where you went. It was the place of opportunity. Ohio, the Western Reserve, Michigan. There's a great line. The motto, if you can believe this, Aaron, the motto of Detroit in the early part of the 1900s, not the 1970s, the 1900s, is the city where life is worth living. That was the motto of Detroit. Detroit was the magnet where you went because there were so many opportunities there. The case that I would make is that with the industrial revolution and its full ascendancy, what it did is it taught or trained the people out of that creativity. And I think that's what Silicon Valley hasn't done, at least yet. And so the question is, what does it look like in this very practical, very engineering kind of thing? Is it possible for there to be people who think creatively, or to be taught to think creatively, or to recognize that there's more than just kind of the engineer? And I say this not in a negative sense, but I don't mean it fully negatively. In an engineering sense, is that I have to control, I have to know, it has to be standard, it has to be replicatable. Can we actually help people see there are bigger possibilities than what you're seeing right now? And in a sense, to take the good of that world and step into a new place that's actually very creative.
Yeah, well, I treat the masculinist as an exploration. I don't know exactly where it's going to go. I don't know where it's going. I don't know exactly how I'm going to get there.
Yes.
But a lot of the things that have been the biggest, again, the biggest supports to me in building it have been things I didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
And I keep bringing up, I bring up that, Rod Dreher, somebody sent Rod Dreher my newsletter and he wrote about it. And then I got invited here, I got invited. So things start happening. But if I hadn't taken the first step, if I said, well, who's going to promote it? Well, nobody will promote it. So I guess I better just, you don't have any connections. I do think there's something there. And we are in this unprecedented world for Christianity. And I don't think that everybody, as you said, not everybody's an explorer. But when we become overly dominated by, I don't know if they were settlers, we call them settlers. Maybe they're not all settlers. Maybe they were explorers. Tim Keller was an explorer 35 years ago. I would say he's not an explorer today because he figured it out. He built this thing, and now he's kind of got that. A lot of the baby boomer generation, they were explorers, and earlier, but now we have sort of a boomer dominated, and you're a baby boomer, so I can say this. We have an overly boomer dominated culture where, the people who are kind of running the show of just doing more and more of what they already know how to do, and they're not necessarily adaptable. So I think this idea of exploration, it's a skill we need to fit into so many things that we're doing. Yeah. And I got a question here. Is this right? No, that's the wrong question because I already answered that question. Here's for you. How could we make the case, from Kevin, how could we make the case that we need to explore now even more than before we had all the world's information at our fingertips? So we have all the world's, information at our fingertips. We have all these experts. Trust the experts, I always say. How do we make the case for exploration to people? Because it is a little bit, when you don't really know what where you're going sometimes, the idea of like, well, let's get in these ships and start sailing off into that sea. Like, wow, how do you make the case that that we need to have more of a mindset of this, or at least add this tool to our tool chest?
Yeah, no, thank you, Kevin. This is a great question. And I think it is a very real question in the world today. And so here's one of the things that I would say. First of all, information is not finite. Information is actually infinite. And I would actually make the case that the opportunities for knowledge are infinite. We have not arrived. As I look through history, kind of each generation has thought they have arrived. And if you remember, there's kind of this famous story, and I can't remember what year it was, but the patent office was thinking about closing down because everything had been discovered. And this was like 80, 90 years ago. And I think at each season of our lives, we think we have so much information and that there's nothing else to find. I was speaking, I did a kind of a keynote presentation at a conference a number of years ago. And in the midst, as I was speaking, I said, there is opportunities all around us. And if we really believe that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and that God has given us everything we need. And I was kind of giving this illustration in my presentation. I said, is it possible? And I pointed right next to, as often you have when you're speaking, there was this plant, like this kind of palm leafy thing next to where I was speaking at the podium. And I said, is it possible that God is looking at us and saying, don't you see it? I gave you this, and I pointed to the palm tree. This is the cure for cancer. Why has no one figured it out yet? Mm-hmm. And I think that as we look around, whether it's the power of the sun for energy, whether it's various plants that can be used for medicine when it comes to various food, I think Kevin is right. There is lots of information around us, and we can become overwhelmed by that and saying, I have everything that I need and know. But the reality is there are problems that are not solved. There are opportunities to live, if you will, better, or in ways that are kind of more flourishing. I love the word flourishing. There are things that can come to us that help us live a more flourishing life than we have right now. And so we can look at I got my glass here. You can look at the glass half full, or you can look at the glass half empty. And if I want to look at the world as half full, the glass is half full, or the world is half full, you know what? I'm going to, have one perspective. But if I say it's half empty, I'm going to have another. And so I think that the real challenge is to help people say there are still things to be discovered, continue to dream, continue to look, continue to wonder. I think the other thing that I would say, Kevin, is do we, knowing what to turn on and what to turn off. One of the things that I have, and there's been multiple people that I've heard talk about this. There's a book by a guy named Cal Newport recently on, you remember, I have lots of books, but I don't always remember the names. Cal, he's at Georgetown University. It's like Essential Minimalism or something like that. And for me, was this recognition that at times social media, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or all this stuff, it's just massive distraction. And I've really taken a step back on my digital footprint because I realized it was occupying my time, but it wasn't really helping me to think. And so while there may be, there's a difference between information and noise. And I would actually say the world is noisier than ever, but they're not necessarily more information at times, but there is more noise. It's kind of interesting, Aaron. As you know, I live outside of Philadelphia here. You've been to our bank many times. And then
this guy lives in a bank, by the way. He bought an old bank, and it's now his house.
Yeah, I know.
It doesn't get much cooler than that.
No, I guess we lived for years. The bank owned me. Now I own the bank, Aaron. Yeah. And but anyway, I spend time. I live here, in New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia. Then I spend time in Chicago. My life in Chicago is fundamentally different than my life in New Jersey right now. And I made some specific choices, Aaron. When I go to Chicago, I never listen to the news. I never read a newspaper. I don't listen to the news. I don't watch TV or anything. Chicago, I listen to WFMT, the classical music station. I listen to that. I do my work at Trinity, and I do odd jobs for I stay at the house where my wife grew up. I stay there. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law live there. I do odd jobs to help around the yard, and I go running in the morning. And last summer, in the midst of the world falling apart, I started thinking, and I said, you know what? My life is pretty good. And I realized what was happening while I was in Chicago. I wasn't listening to all the noise. I was doing my work. I was living. I was eating. I was flourishing in a difficult time. Now, I'm not saying there was lots of difficulty all around me, and I recognize that. My point is, I turned down the noise, and when I turned down the noise, kind of like my life kind of got turned up, and it was a really healthy change.
Yeah, I think that's one of Nassim Taleb's ideas is, stop reading the news. I mean, the news. My wife actually started this thing that she does. We get the Sunday New York Times print edition. She reads it a week late. So she reads them a week and she just goes through and it's like, and that way I don't read, I read the interesting features and stuff. It's amazing how much more pleasant experience it is when you're not just reading the noise of the daily fray.
Yep.
That are there. But I think that's a lot of it. They want us on social media, and I'm a social media guy, so I can't complain. They want us, consuming entertainment. They want us paying attention to the fray, not to what's important to us. And this information overload. So I think maybe we can go ahead and wrap up here. Is there anything else you just want to say on the topic? Give you the opportunity to close out. We're not pressed for time, but I don't want to just extend just to extend.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that kind of come to my mind. One is, and I'll come back to this we said earlier. One is that we all have the opportunity to explore. We don't have to be trapped. It's not a finite world. I think there's broad opportunities. I've worked with a lot of interesting clients over time. And everyone came to me with an idea that kind of like, there's something like this that we're trying to figure out. And we help them, if you will, land that plane and figure out the way forward. And so one, exploration is available and open to all of us. I think the other thing that I would say is that this is an opportune time. And I think what Kevin this last question here, this is an opportune time for exploration. And coming out of a pandemic like this, habits have been changed, practices have been changed. We're actually having to ask the question, why, once again? Why is this here? Why do I go to church? Why am I involved in this? Where am I spending my time? All the why kind of questions. This is a time for opportune exploration. This is a time for, in a sense, people to really say what's important. And I think exploration is a way to do it. There's some work that I've done on the seasons of exploration. And I think this is a startup time. And it may not feel like a startup time, but we have a lot of kind of brownfield around us where there's things that have been built that are falling apart. We're in a greenfield time where we have an opportunity to create new things. I think exploration is really, really viable for that. And so I think
it was Mark Andreessen, the guy who invented Netscape. Now he's a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. He called it a time to build.
Yes. Yeah, it is a time to build. And that's where I say, I'm actually curious to see over the next 12 to 24 months, the new ideas that you and I cannot even imagine or conceive of, that if people have been home tinkering in their basements, thinking, dreaming, doing some stuff that has been kind of outside of the public eye, I'm curious to see what emerges in our world that we never could have imagined today that is actually going to be critical. And say, if you were to say to me, Dwight, what are the critical things that you don't have right now that you really need? I can't think about, I don't know what that might be, to be honest. But I have a hunch that 24 months from now, there's something going to be birthed or launched that you and I are going to say 5 years from now, how did we ever live without it? And it was
Right.
something that was launched out of this pandemic. And so that's why I say, your church, your organization, your family, your business, this is an opportune time to build. I think the world is ripe for it. And let's see where it all goes.
Well, Dwight, thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining. I know you're very busy with Trinity and elsewhere, and traveling back between cities. I always find it very enjoyable, and hopefully, people, this helps people to start thinking about like, how do I maybe rethink or explore, this future, this unknown, highly uncertain future that we all find ourselves now suddenly facing. It was always that way, but previously we had this illusion. But be interested in that. So again, thank you for joining. I appreciate it.
Hey, great to be with you, Aaron, anytime.